So we are ready to begin. I would like everyone to take your seats. We are about to begin panel number 2 of the Schiller Institute ICLC conference. The panel is entitled, "What Really Is American Exceptionalism?" From Benjamin Franklin and John Quincy Adams to Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon LaRouche. While there is a great temptation to tell several jokes about what this American exceptionalism might consist of, maybe it's best to simply say 2 things in opening this panel. As you know, Lyndon LaRouche had commissioned that there be work on this topic and that it be presented at this panel in order to try to shed light on what it is about the United States that makes it capable of performing the mission that he has outlined, and you already heard outlined earlier this afternoon by him. To begin our panel, we have Graham Lowry, who, as you all know, is the author of a book on this topic, How America Was Won. And it's called, or How the Nation Was Won, but I like America. I stuck that in, see, because I think it's exceptional, so I want to touch it in, see, because it's a Noah nation, right? So, and he's going to speak about the exceptional mission of America. Graham.
Well, I'm glad Dennis took care of all the jokes. Let me see. What do I do, Charles? No touch? I'm not sure people can hear from this height.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. One little quickie. Well, the effort to build a republic in America, launched by the leading Republican circles of Europe when it became clear that it simply couldn't be done there, was always conceived as a mission to benefit all of mankind. And from the beginning, the long struggle to found the United States was based on the idea that every human being was created in the image of God, endowed with the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and blessed with the ability to do God's work on earth. Lyndon LaRouche re-emphasized a few months ago the historically exceptional quality of the American Revolution and its federal constitution, and historical specificity, which still today is unique in all of human history to date. And it began with the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, which was essentially the beachhead for beginning a project for a constitutional republic in the New World, and which provided Benjamin Franklin the traditions upon which he developed an entire independent sovereign republic. John Winthrop, the founder, wrote in 1629 about the depths of degeneracy, familiar today also, then destroying England under oligarchical rule. He said, "This land grows weary of her inhabitants. So as man, who is the most precious of all creatures, is here more vile and base than the earth we tread upon, and of less price among us than a horse or a sheep." Winthrop's argument was set forth as to the necessity of undertaking the colonization of the Massachusetts Bay, despite all practical notions about what was possible. And it essentially was a declaration of war against the oligarchy's insistence that man is no different from the beasts. So Winthrop started with the fundamental, shall we say, Republican economic policy declaration in human history. From Genesis, "The whole earth is the Lord's garden, and he hath given it to the sons of men with a general condition, increase and multiply. Replenish the earth and subdue it, that man might enjoy the fruits of the earth and God might have his due glory from the creature." Why, Winthrop asked, suffer a whole continent as fruitful and convenient for the use of man, to lie waste without any improvement. This is not an American exceptionalism to have the right to anti-nativist imperialism or manifest destiny, territorial greed. It was defined very clearly, John Winthrop, as governor of the Mass Bay Colony, defined, for example, Christian liberty as the liberty to do that only which is good, just, and honest. This liberty you are to stand for, he said, with the hazard not just of your lives, not just of your goods, but of your lives, if need be. And the battle to break the grip of the European oligarchy frequently required just that. Yet the Massachusetts Bay attained spectacular rates of growth under its own Republican institutions. It had a charter which Charles I, the chump, had unwittingly approved, which authorized the Massachusetts Bay Company to govern its own affairs from New England, rather than the standard of, the board of directors sitting around in London, essentially seeing how the stocks were going up and down on whatever looting adventure they'd launched and rarely heard much back from at that time. In Massachusetts, using this power, Winthrop proceeded to establish, with his allies, a whole array of Republican institutions, the like of which the world had never seen. With a system of government with actual elected officials who knew something, and which extended all the way from the township level to the legislature to the governor of the colony. They founded the first system of public education in the world, from grammar schools, local academies, and even Harvard College, which was then actually a publicly funded institution chartered by the legislature. And a written constitution, not one of these fake British things, the unwritten constitution nobody knows about. It's called the Body of Liberties, which also overturned the use of any arbitrary precedent in English common law. And the legislature soon added an unprecedented protection for the citizens by ordering the printing of the laws. Sounds simple enough, but no one had done it. And Massachusetts devoted its only printing press to this task. And they did it, they said, whereby we may manifest our utter disaffection to arbitrary government. Their program for economic development, aimed always for the benefit of the entire population, was accelerated both by public subsidies, tax incentives. They rapidly developed such things as textile manufacturing, mining ventures, iron production. By 1647, in fact, John Winthrop's son, John Winthrop Jr., had overseen the construction of the world's first integrated, automated industrial complex at Saugus, Massachusetts, which by the end of its first year in 1647 was turning out 8 tons of automatically wrought iron per week, which was far beyond the best works in England or really anywhere else at that point. So all of this naturally drove the oligarchy, the Stuart monarchy, into fits of rage. And numerous assaults on New England as a whole, especially after John Winthrop Jr. as governor of Connecticut from 1657 until his death in 1676, replicated much of what his father's leadership had generated in Massachusetts. This tale of resistance is heroic enough in itself, escalating attacks on trying to revoke the charter, seize half of Connecticut by force of arms, so they can't hear. Little, bits of gunboat diplomacy, and by the mid-1670s, when all those had failed, the standard which the British would resort to all the way through into the late 19th century in our western plains, provoke some Indian raids, slaughter outposts of settlements. And in this case, the outbreak, the worst in New England history as an Indian war, so-called King Philip's War of 1675-76, laid waste to scores of towns in western Massachusetts and other outlying New England settlements. And the royal governor, Edmund Andros himself, had instigated the war by bribing the Indians and arming them to go and slaughter His Majesty's subjects. So this kind of thing they're up against all the time. The charter itself was finally officially revoked in 1684. And Increase Mather, then the leading statesman, scientist, educator, and minister, then New England's Republican leader, very interestingly, when he denounced the effort to revoke the charter, the reason he cited was that it would be inconsistent with the main end of their fathers coming to New England. Let them put their trust in the God of their fathers, which is better than to put confidence in princes, Mather urged. So the mission in his mind was clear from the beginning. They didn't come to, eat some pumpkins and things like that. Now, Increase Mather's son, Cotton, during the Venetian-directed invasion, which they are fond of calling in Britain the Glorious Revolution. This was a straight Venetian-run looting job. They dumped James II. They installed this strange bisexual William of Orange as king. Well, and so in the chaos that was unfolding at that point, Cotton Mather shrewdly took the occasion to throw Governor Edmund Andros in the clink, a bloodless coup, after which they reproclaimed a New England-wide republic with powers to run their own courts, mint their own currency, established virtually all and more than had been typical under the original charter of the Massachusetts Bay. This didn't stick, unfortunately, and Increase in London had to secure the best charter he could from King William. And then in 1696, a theme which we can recognize many times in this struggle to keep the humanity of the world alive, Schiller echoes it virtually a century later. Cotton Mather said that New England had once abounded with heroes worthy to have their lives written as copy for future ages to write after, but these are ancient things. And essentially, he said that all that we had that once ran through New England are ancient things. There seems to be a shameful shrink in all sorts of men among us from that greatness and goodness which adorned our ancestors. We grow little every way, little in our civil matters, little in our military matters, little in our ecclesiastical matters. We dwindle away to nothing. And it was going to get a little worse. After 1700, they were treated by the new royal governor, Governor Dudley, to outright treason. The English and the French made a treaty in 1701 with the Iroquois Five Nations in which they agreed to do nothing, stand aside, and let the Iroquois slaughter, again, His Majesty's subjects in New England, New York, or anywhere else they could get to. Then they went to war against one another, England and France. It was a very gentlemanly kind of procedure. But the main objective, of course, exterminate any chances for America to expand while these European oligarchical powers are having a little internal fracas. So by 1706, the year Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston, things had reached such an abysmal state of affairs that the governor was nearly charged with high crimes, quote unquote, by the legislature because he'd been caught using Boston merchant vessels, which were supposed to exchange prisoners with those held in French Canada. Instead, they were going up there stuffed with supplies and arms for the Indians, who were then destroying Massachusetts all the way from western Mass at Deerfield to within 40 miles of Boston. There's a governor you can look up to any time, sees it taking care of you. So this would be a situation, if you were born into it, as Franklin was, which you might consider almost hopeless. Here was the beachhead for a continental republic in America, virtually just becoming a little bit of erosion in the face of this decay. And even though Franklin appears to have inherited maybe a whole mess of trouble, he also inherited this Republican nation-building tradition, and pretty soon he inherited Cotton Mather as his mentor. Josiah Franklin, Benjamin's father, had joined the nonconformist opposition to Charles II. Anything that didn't support him seemed nonconformist, actually, at that point in his career. But this was at near the end of that degenerate's reign. Josiah then emigrated to Massachusetts, like many who came to America at various points, as virtually a political refugee. And soon he was a member of the congregation of the Old South Church, which stood right next to the house where the founding Governor John Winthrop had lived. The British later tore it down and chopped it up for firewood during the American Revolution, showing their respect for history and tradition. And Josiah Franklin very soon became a political organizer for Cotton Mather, who was organizing chapters, who was organizing things called associated families, who was organizing things called reforming societies. And the purpose of all these was to begin to rekindle and then raise to another level a spirit of the mission they had come for, and establish a sense of being Republican citizens, even though they did not yet have a republic, and the one they had nearly had been obliterated virtually. So this became sort of a public fact, and a very important one in American history, when in 1710 Cotton Mather published anonymously, as most things had to be in those days, an organizing manual on how to create a Republican citizenry. It came to be known as Essays to Do Good. And he makes very clear what this quality is again. Mather says, "It is an invaluable honor to do good. It is an incomparable pleasure. A man must look upon himself as dignified and gratified by God. When an opportunity to do good is put into his hands, he must embrace it with rapture as enabling him to answer the great end of his being." And respecting the decay of Massachusetts since it had lost its charter, his polemic is very clear. Government is called, he said, the ordinance of God. Thus it should vigorously pursue those noble and blessed ends for which it is ordained, the good of mankind. In 1784, looking back on his quite significant career of contributing to bringing us our republic, Benjamin Franklin wrote to Cotton Mather's son, Samuel. He'd had the fun of reading the Declaration of Independence from his pulpit in Boston in 1776. And he wrote that Essays to Do Good had an influence on my conduct through life, for I have always set a greater value on the character of a doer of good than on any other kind of reputation. And if I have been, as you seem to think, a useful citizen, the public owes the advantage of it to that book. Now, besides the fact that from the earliest periods of settlement, America's leaders had a commitment to forging a continental republic, the good news is they'd also devised a strategy to do it. And the key to developing the continent was the Ohio River. And if you just look at a map, you'll see why. The Ohio is this wonderful, about 922 some mile highway, waterway, from what is now Pittsburgh, straight on into the Mississippi River. It's navigable the entire way except for some falls around what is now Louisville, Kentucky. And everybody had their eyes on this from the late 17th century on. And you'll see, if you follow the Ohio, when you're going through what would open up the entire Middle West. When you reach the Mississippi, you opened up everything from the Gulf of Mexico to the upper Great Lakes. And you have essentially a way also to outflank what was then the menace of a very hostile Canadian situation, held by France at this point, but only nominally ever for French settlement, mostly a peculiar brand of French Jesuits, trained Indians there in fine religious arts such as scalping and so forth, and unleashed them on any so-called English antichrist settlements below the Canadian border, below Quebec and the Great Lakes. So there was a three-pronged strategy to break into the Ohio River, without which we could not have even dreamed of forging a continental republic. The first was a route which conveniently could take advantage of the Hudson River going up from New York, and then crossing west of Albany along the Mohawk River line. This map may not show all the little squiggles as far as I would like, and you probably can't see any of it 20 feet away, but it's the best I could do. Anyway, on that line, you would go out to Lake Ontario as one option, across a section of Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, and from Lake Erie, in what was then known territory, you went down a little thing called French Creek, leading into the Allegheny River, which flows south into Pittsburgh, forming the northern fork of what joins to form the Ohio River as the Monongahela comes up from the south, which is the second route. Take the western stretches of the Potomac, which don't end at the Washington Monument, by the way. They go way past Harper's Ferry, deep into the mountains of the western Appalachians. And then from there, you can kind of either hoof it, or occasionally you can get some added water transport to Cheat River into the Monongahela, and the Monongahela definitely to Pittsburgh, the site of what later became Pittsburgh, and the Ohio. And the third route, from Virginia, which held the key to much of this project, straight out the James River, and through, by that means, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and then to link up, after following an old Indian trail, to the New River, which sort of winds its way a little northwest, and through another mountain pass where it's renamed the Great Kanawha. And that river flows north straight into the Ohio, what is now Point Pleasant. So all of these things ranging from southern Virginia to the upper Hudson Valley are pointed at that same objective. Can we open up the Ohio country and thereby begin the process of developing the whole continent? Now, some people are shocked by this. Even I was shocked by it when I first found out. We didn't wait around to explore all these things and get to the Ohio or to the routes that would take us there, until sometime in the middle of the 18th century. No, these things began in the 1660s, even against the literature at the time and myths of the time that you could never even cross the Blue Ridge Mountains. They were considered to be, like 17 miles high and terrible monsters on the other side and so forth. This was a favorite tale of the Tidewater oligarchs who had scarfed up the land and left everybody kind of high and dry otherwise. This central route that would take the western Potomac became a viable prospect as early as 1669, when a German explorer and geologist named John Lederer found a pass through the high mountains of the Blue Ridge and on into the vast Shenandoah Valley, which runs down on the west side, between the Blue Ridge, west side of the Blue Ridge, comes the Great Valley of Virginia, and then begins to turn west again towards ultimately the Cumberland Gap, southwestern Virginia, and the junction with Kentucky and Tennessee. So Lederer finds this as early as 69. He does several expeditions. A map of his journeys is published in London no later, the very year, 1671. Of course, he then says, let me demonstrate this to you. And he takes a bunch of these, prominent landholders, plantation holders, on a little trip to show them that, hey, I found a pass through the Blue Ridge, and you should see what's over there. They turned back before they reached the mountains, reported him dead. And when he showed up and protested that, contrary to the premature rumor, he was alive, they denied he'd ever found anything. Like he'd just taken a little run into, around town a few times, came back. So he went off to work for 3 years for Governor John Winthrop, Jr. of Connecticut, who was in correspondence with Gottfried Leibniz at that point. So the word quickly lit up the boards in Europe, especially when Lederer's map was published in London in 1671. So the genie was out of the bottle. And that same year, another Virginian who founded what is now the city of Petersburg in southern Virginia, southwest of Richmond, inspired by these reports of Lederer's discoveries, he was a Virginia militia general named Abraham Wood. So he assembled an expedition and sent it deep into the west, actually breaking through beyond the New River, following that to the point also where it breaks through this mountain pass, and from then on becomes the Great Kanawha all the way to Ohio. In fact, one of the guys on this mission ends up in Ohio, finding himself surrounded by Shawnee, and somehow lives to get back with the story. 1671. The northern route, which otherwise looks fairly appealing, unfortunately is the closest to what Cotton Mather referred to as the eye of the vulture, which was this Jesuit-run string of less than Marquess of Queensberry tribes and so forth. And that was vulnerable repeatedly to attacks, and therefore the least likely to succeed in the short term, unless you could go up and knock out Montreal and Quebec, the only military backup for these Indian operations. Then you might be able to follow that northern route. But anyway, very early on, Massachusetts tried to do it anyway with an expedition in 1690, aimed to strike Quebec. Another expedition timed with it to come up from New York, the Champlain Valley, and take Montreal. Not to destroy them, but simply to neutralize this menace that was constantly coming down and destroying any westward efforts at settlement in America. So another expedition in 1711 for this northern route, first trying to take out Canada, sabotaged by the British Admiralty. They brought over about 11,000 men, deliberately ran one boat into the rocks, said, "Oh, my goodness, this won't do." Turned the whole thing back, went back to England, never fired a shot. Another attempt succeeded in 1745, but that's because Massachusetts did it on its own, never even told London what it was doing, just went up and said, "We're going to knock over Louisbourg," the greatest French fortress on the planet at that point, with a couple of little pop guns and, you know, their hardy semi-trained militia, and they did it, leaving George II in near apoplexy, and the British trying to figure out how they could give it back to the French without too much difficulty. Because, of course, the British always figured it was cheaper to let the French slaughter the Americans and keep their troops up there than to pay for their own lads to go up and have to do the job out of the Queen's purse or the King's purse. So you might ask, did the British know that America's objective all along was to develop a continental republic? You bet. Just look at the record throughout the 18th century. Every time Americans moved to open the West. Now, we kind of kicked them in the shins a few times, at least. During Benjamin Franklin's childhood, when these meetings are going on in his father's house, Josiah's house, because Mather's political organization for that district met at the Franklin House. He was just steeped in his organizing perspective and in an idea of what distinguished the struggle going on in America from this bunch of barbarians trying to run the world from thrones and feudal fiefdoms and so forth in Europe, Britain, and so on. In 1710, the year Mather published the Essays to Do Good, we had new colonial governors steaming into New York, Robert Hunter, and Virginia, Alexander Spotswood. They were both friends of Jonathan Swift. I've talked about him before. We'll have to skip a few things tonight. But Swift, remember, was Leibniz's leading agent in the English-speaking world and a master strategist himself. His output far exceeds merely Gulliver's Travels, although that is probably everybody's favorite in certain ways. Even Daniel Boone had his troops read it out by firelight in the Kentucky frontier during the Revolution. So, these new thrusts, Spotswood walks into Williamsburg and says, "We're going straight out the James to the Mississippi, period. We're going up the full length of the Potomac, up what he has heard is called the Wabash, the Wabash, Indiana. We're going to hook up to the Great Lakes. We're going to have to strike straight to the lakes." And here these Virginia guys who think that the world ends at the Blue Ridge, and they're hearing about places like the Mississippi, the Wabash, the Great Lakes. So, I mean, what? So they thought he was crazy, but he came with a cannonball that had hit him at Blenheim before he resigned from Marlborough's butcher army during the years of Queen Anne. Hunter was doing the same thing. He moved about 4,000 German refugees of Marlborough's wars in Europe, or his slaughters of his own officers in Europe, as they were often known. You could collect every time your officer died, you see, because you could sell his commission to the next chump you were about to send off to die. And he was later charged with a little profiteering and murdering his own officers. Anyway, Spotswood and Hunter were smart enough to come to America. And Hunter brought with him about 4,000 German Palatinate refugees. His plan was to take them straight up the Hudson, settle them along the Mohawk, and begin to open up by actually colonizing and developing that northern route for the time when they might be free of the constant assaults from Canada. So this proceeding at a rather rapid pace, of course, again, doesn't go unnoticed. Spotswood then concludes in 1722 a treaty with the Iroquois nations whereby they say, okay, we will no longer come across the Blue Ridge, west to east, and we won't go south of the Potomac. Of course, Spotswood, the boys are there with the map, shows the Potomac goes way out. And that opened up the main routes for Virginia to what they called the Ohio country, the Ohio River Valley. Spotswood got back to Williamsburg, found he was out of a job. Robert Walpole and the Hellfire Club boys for King George I had ousted him. So the very next year, Cotton Mather sent Benjamin Franklin to Philadelphia on a rather complex and secret mission. But the ultimate thrust was to begin reproducing this drive to create a Republican citizenry, even though this was not the Pennsylvania of William Penn anymore. This was the Pennsylvania of one of his dingbat sons who sort of liked the oligarchical style, you know, and had recut his cloth and wouldn't allow anybody to pick up a gun to defend the colony or anything, but it was just dandy if he could loot it. So Franklin goes down there and starts recreating the institutions of Massachusetts, specifically the organizing institutions of Cotton Mather. This position that he begins to develop for himself through this organizing process gets a little boost in 1737 from an interesting person, Alexander Spotswood, who by this time has come back and is Postmaster General for America. Nice intelligence post. So he appoints Benjamin Franklin Postmaster of Philadelphia. And Franklin then begins the business of setting an agenda for building a sovereign nation-state, a republic. And actually, my wife and I were reviewing sort of a whole flood of infrastructural developments, inventions, explorations, strategies for opening up the West and so forth, going all the way up, and I'll mention a few of them later, past 1800. And virtually the whole thing is down as a blueprint for building the nation in Franklin's founding document for the American Philosophical Society, the proposal for it drafted in 1744. And, I mean, it's simply a task force agenda for building the nation. And, of course, he uses as his founding group people drawn from his own original institutions, copied from Mather's, the Junto, which he sets up in Philadelphia, based on Mather's associated families and reforming societies in Massachusetts. And the proposal, remember, he calls the proposal for promoting useful knowledge among the British plantations in America. So he says we have to have a society of ingenious men, or virtuosi. And in the several colonies, begins thinking about, let's expand this national project. And they should be in constant correspondence. And the subjects of the correspondence should include things like botany, medicine, geology, metallurgy, new mechanical inventions for saving labor, and such applications as milling, transportation, irrigation, all new arts, trades, and manufactures that may be proposed or thought of, surveys, maps, and charts of particular parts of the seacoasts or inland countries, courses and junctions of rivers and great roads, situation of lakes and mountains, nature of the soil and productions, new methods of improving the breed of useful animals, introducing other sorts from foreign countries, new improvements in planting, gardening, and clearing land, and all philosophical experiments that let light into the nature of things, tend to increase the power of man over matter and multiply the conveniences or pleasures of life. So the military threat from this point of 1744 onward intensifies, and you've got the French, the Spanish. I mean, warships are coming up the Delaware to within 20 miles of Philadelphia. Indian tribes are unleashed again after even the seizure of Louisburg, all across the northern frontier lines of New York and New England. In fact, this Rochester, New Hampshire is overrun. That's before Lynn was born, but all the way to Saratoga, New York. And meanwhile, the French start building up more forts in the Ohio country and west to strengthen that line of containment. Forts in Ohio, Indiana, and a rather famous one, as it'll turn out, Vincennes in Indiana on the Wabash. Now, 22-year-old Colonel George Washington of the Virginia militia, who was a straight Spotswood sort of political heir. His father had worked with Spotswood in an iron-making industry, and Virginia began some major innovations under Spotswood in iron production. And he eagerly sort of gets into the scrape when his older brother Lawrence is killed, cannon fodder for the British in a fruitless venture in the Caribbean. So in 1754, Washington sort of starts the French and Indian War by going and challenging French incursions into territory claimed by Virginia. And there's this famous little fracas at Jumonville Glen, south of Uniontown, Pennsylvania today. And Franklin is primed for this, and already there is convened in Albany a colonial congress to discuss a plan of union of all the colonies. Now, it doesn't sound like all that great stuff because it allows the British to name a general governor for these American colonies and so forth, but they have a lot of interesting little powers. They can raise armies and equip vessels and guard their own coasts, and they can finance defense, and they can make laws and levy general duties and imposts and taxes. In other words, they've got pretty much everything, but the king will have to be given the right to name this governor. Well, how long he might last is another matter, of course. And Franklin makes clear that the point of this union is it's absolutely necessary for their preservation. And an important part of it must be the settling of western lands. And he proposes strong forts on the lakes, the Ohio, etc. And at the same time, they may secure our present frontiers, serve to defend new colonies, settle in their protection, and better secure the friendship of the far Indians. Now, later, in 1789, he's sort of reminiscing on this scheme. You can guess the reception it got in London. He says, the fate of the plan was singular, for though after many days of thorough discussion of all of its parts in Congress, and was unanimously agreed to, copies were ordered sent to the Assembly of each province for concurrence, and one to the Ministry in England for the approbation of the Crown. The Crown disapproved of it, as having placed too much weight in the democratic part of the Constitution, and every assembly as having allowed too much prerogative. So it was totally rejected. This is basically the tactic throughout. Keep proposing what is just, even sane, honest. And the king will turn it down every time. So you're close to the discovery of how to get past the mists and the myth that we had a wonderful Mother England all that time until somewhere in the 1760s they got nasty and taxed us for tea and stamps, things like that. This thing was total war from the beginning, and the British kept proving they weren't going to allow us to exist. So 1755, Washington set this war in motion. They said, yeah, we'll send General Braddock out. He'll take care of the little beasts. So they sent him all the drunks and jailbirds and so forth, exiled from the British Army in Ireland, lucky Irish. Pack him onto some ships, send him over to Baltimore, dump him off. Poor old Braddock, who probably wasn't so bad. And Washington, with his Virginia militia, kind of lugged him and his cannon all this way, to Pittsburgh, where they got annihilated by an Indian surprise attack. Not too big a surprise, but they didn't know what to do with it, the British. So they ran it. Before they even got word in Baltimore, the whole flotilla of supplies, another whole supply, fleet, turned around and sailed back to England. So even if they wanted to regroup, no dice. So the main casualties of this, other than Braddock, who lost his life, it almost cost us the lives of George Washington and Daniel Boone, which would have been very serious. Boone, at that point, remember, Benjamin Franklin had recruited as the wagon master to try to get this Braddock and his, moronic army out to somewhere near Fort Duquesne. So that was the last engagement we were ever allowed to fight across beyond the mountains during the whole French and Indian, or in Europe, the 7 Years' War. 1756 to 63 on the European side. But Americans, as they await this chance now with, can the war be ended on good terms? Yeah, all the American soldiers they could find, the British took up into Canada, liberally spent some lives there, and took over Canada from the French. Or did they? Pretty soon the word is, and Franklin's in London, they want to give it back, all of Canada, and leave the Jesuits there, who were already being kicked out of France the same year. So Franklin says, no, not going to fly, and there's a lot of outrage among American leaders in the colonies. They wanted to give back all of Canada for Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe. It's about, even on that map, it'd be a speck, you know. An island in the Caribbean convenient for sort of refurbishing and resupplying the slave trade. So, reluctantly, Lord Pitt had to settle for Canada. But they left the Jesuits, and within 2 weeks of news of the settlement of the Treaty of Paris of 1763, some mysterious Indian nobody ever heard of named Pontiac, wasn't even an automobile by then, gathered up all these Indians from way out, you know, beyond and above the Great Lakes, Canada, the near plains and so on. And in a 2-week period, or 8-week period, they struck on a 900-mile front from the upper Great Lakes all the way down to the southern Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, essentially wiping out every, quote, British or American settlement and garrison that we had past the mountains. What's the message? Braddock tried, no, 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 no. We defeat Canada, you think you're going west to develop Canada? No, 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 no. Now the king announces, out of his loving concern for his poor subjects, the Americans, he's going to issue the proclamation line. And he just draws a line right down the ridge of the Appalachians. And he says, in your interest and to protect you and safeguard you, I have decided to allow none of you to ever cross that line again. There will be no more development of the West. There'll be no settlement. There'll be no nothing. You think the American Revolution was just something we kind of got around to in the 1770s? The thing was on, for real, at this point. 1763, this abomination. No protection. They just unleashed everything that the French probably couldn't even have mustered quite as well. And so George Washington founds immediately the Mississippi Company that same year, designed to settle lands both north and west of the Ohio River. Daniel Boone follows some earlier explorations by others coming out on our sort of third-tier route, and by 1767 begins explorations of Kentucky. In 1769, he passes through the Cumberland Gap for the first time, that kind of strange little place between the borders of Kentucky, Tennessee, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, North Carolina. But it feeds on into southeastern Kentucky. In 1772, confronting this task, how are we going to rapidly move to develop the West, Washington proposes for the first time to the Virginia House of Burgesses constructing a canal all the way from Tidewater, Virginia, to the Ohio River, using the Potomac as a major sort of waterway leg of it. Now, the simple way to look at this is we fought a revolution, which actually begins, as you know, in 1775. It takes a year, or 4 if we want to get real technical. But in 1775, the fighting in earnest. We don't declare independence until the 4th of July, 76. But the war for the West has already begun. And it is the war for the West which will decide it, for a very simple reason. It not only decides it strategically, but without it, you cannot fulfill America's exceptional mission. You cannot have a mission which is called, I'm going to bump the guy with the red pants off the shore and sit here on the same little dumpy stretch of the Atlantic and wait for the millennium. You have to keep developing. That's why man's on this planet. You have to keep innovating. You have to keep discovering. So if we didn't commit to going west and developing the continent, we wouldn't have had anybody to rally for a war of independence. But we did. So in 1775, in an extraordinary development which drives the British bananas, Daniel Boone leads a party into Kentucky and sets up about 4 crucially placed forts to hold against British-directed Indian attacks. The strategic significance of Kentucky is that it was the one place that all the Indian tribes of the rather broad environs regarded as sort of a neutral hunting ground, because they couldn't be out rampaging and have winter come and no place to retreat to for food, not being blessed with, railroads and refrigerator cars and so forth. So if Kentucky were held by the, quote, enemy, the white man, or whoever the British said was the enemy, they would not go east, because their food supply in their rear would be cut off. Now, why did the British come tooling in their big warships and their big generals and camp essentially just in our major ports, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston? Well, first of all, they didn't want to leave town. They came and they grabbed everything they could and they ate around the clock. That's how they ultimately subverted poor old Benedict Arnold in Philadelphia. But anyway, the British thought that if they sat there controlling all commerce, all cities, all banks, and so forth, and just waited for mass Indian onslaughts to crush the American army from the rear, while they had us pinned up along the coast with their big, fully trained armies and tons of supplies, they'd just crush it. Well, they blew it. Washington convened every meeting of his officer corps, his general staff. First question on the agenda: how goes the war in the West? And the rest of the time, he just moved his troops as best he could, keeping the British pinned along the Atlantic coast, by and large, until such time as they could be drawn into a trap and annihilated. But that could not happen unless you secured the West. So another one of these Virginians, they had all these guys about 6 foot 4 with red hair. It was extraordinary. The Indians got terrified of it. George Rogers Clark was the next they ran into, and he actually besieged the Virginia legislature in 1778 for gunpowder and money and authority to recruit militia to mount a campaign against British forces in Detroit, which was their main base of operations, taking advantage of the Canada business. And they had moved into the Illinois country, and of course this included their assuming that they held the former French towns and forts like Vincennes and so on. But in sort of the winter 1778-79, George Rogers Clark, this is William Clark's older brother, the guy who finally takes us all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the Lewis and Clark expedition. George Rogers Clark, leading a massive army of 179 men and about 16 flags and banners that they can run around with looking like they have more when needed. Have a lot of fun with some of the tactics this guy used, but anyway. He crosses, virtually wades his men through heavy ice in winter, across the Wabash, strikes Vincennes, captures the British commander, who has the elegant sobriquet of Hair Buyer Hamilton. He paid for every American scalp that his Indians brought him. So Washington's strategy for victory prevailed simply because he said, okay, we'll keep him pinned. You defeat him in the West. Clark did. The French virtually greeted us with cheers and jubilation, especially when they heard about the French alliance and Lafayette and so forth. They said, vive l'Amérique. And pretty soon the British were facing a sort of a two-front little problem within the former French incursions into the Midwest. So a lot of other interesting little details in the military aspect, but think of what would have to govern the objective all the time. And this is a very, very long, bitter struggle. As you know, the Continental Army, which was named that from the outset, which should tell you something. It was not called, like Lee's thing, the Army of Northern Virginia, or the Army of Greater Richmond or something. Right? It was the Continental Army. It was designed to secure and free the continent. But it was a little short on manpower, as we are sometimes. And so you had to have, all the militia you could get and so forth. It was very tough. And by the end of this long war, where the British were then prepared to rip it apart from the inside, they had promoted with their long-standing agents, even within the officer corps of Washington's, he knew them, a mutiny. Just as the British had, where we were waiting for the news of the British surrender, they were still sitting with their troops in New York. Washington didn't trust that. He moved his army up the Hudson, remember, to Newburgh, on the west bank of the Hudson. And he was then informed that an anonymous letter was encouraging his troops, his officers, essentially just to never sheathe their swords, to march on the Capitol if need be, demand their back pay, their pensions, and me, and so forth. So, you tried that one before. Yes. He said, if this course of action were followed, who would benefit? Only the British could benefit from such a course. And he urges them instead to reject anyone who tried to overthrow the liberties of America and open the floodgates of civil discord. And he declares, you will defeat the insidious designs of our enemies, who are compelled to resort from open force to secret artifice. You will give one more distinguished proof of unexampled patriotism and patient virtue, rising superior to the pressure of the most complicated sufferings. And you will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world had never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. Shortly before his death in 1799, faced with yet another appeal to lead the nation out of crisis, Washington made explicit the continuity of this entire struggle that he personally had been a leader of in a letter to Jonathan Trumbull. And he says, a mind that has been constantly on the stretch since the year 1753, with but short intervals and little relaxation, requires rest and composure. And I believe that nothing short of a serious invasion of our country, in which case I conceive it to be the duty of every citizen to step forward in its defense, will ever draw me from my present retirement. So what's unleashed? A torrent, an engine of scientific and technological progress, because we have, finally, a sovereign republic. And beginning even before we get the full constitutional republic, we're developing a completely automatic flour mill, Oliver Evans, with backing of George Washington. We begin, by 1787, we've got a water jet-propelled steamboat functioning on the Potomac. The same year, patents go in for the first automobile and steam locomotive. In 1788, we've already founded the first actual town to become a reasonable-sized small city in Ohio proper, at Marietta, mostly of veteran officers of the Revolution, who led it. In 1791, we have the first U.S. patents for the steamboat issued to James Rumsey, John Stevens, John Fitch, not just one, but many inventors beginning to surge forward with this. And almost all of them were personally and directly inspired by either Benjamin Franklin or George Washington, or both. And by 1801, Oliver Evans, now in Philadelphia, has perfected the first high-pressure steam engine, capable of providing enough power for heavy industrial uses and large river and ocean-going steamboats. And by 1802, at Hoboken, John Stevens perfects the screw propeller for his experimental steamboat. 1806, Evans builds the Mars Works in Philadelphia. It sounds satisfying, doesn't it? Which develops into a large complex for producing steam engines and the machine tools to build them. So this whole sort of long wave, accelerating wave, launched by the founding of our republic, sweeps right on into the 1820s. The British are so freaked by 1814, they said, we got to do something. They come burn the Capitol, burn this, raid that. That's not going to stop it. And then this accumulating pressure, the threat that that meant, will be accelerated by yet another of Benjamin Franklin's proteges. The most feared, that he's written almost into oblivion, John Quincy Adams.
Our next speaker is historian Anton. So we are ready to begin. I would like everyone to take your seats. We are about to begin panel number 2 of the Schiller Institute ICLC conference. The panel is entitled, "What Really Is American Exceptionalism?" From Benjamin Franklin and John Quincy Adams to Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon LaRouche. While there is a great temptation to tell several jokes about what this American exceptionalism might consist of, maybe it's best to simply say 2 things in opening this panel. As you know, Lyndon LaRouche had commissioned that there be work on this topic and that it be presented at this panel in order to try to shed light on what it is about the United States that makes it capable of performing the mission that he has outlined, and you already heard outlined earlier this afternoon by him. To begin our panel, we have Graham Lowry, who, as you all know, is the author of a book on this topic, How America Was Won. And it's called, or How the Nation Was Won, but I like America. I stuck that in, see, because I think it's exceptional, so I want to touch it in, see, because it's a Noah nation, right? So, and he's going to speak about the exceptional mission of America. Graham.
Under its own Republican institution. It had a charter which Charles I, the chump, had unwittingly approved, which authorized the Massachusetts Bay Company to govern its own affairs from New England, rather than the standard of, you know, the board of directors sitting around in London, essentially seeing how the stocks were going up and down on whatever looting adventure they'd launched and rarely heard much back from at that time. In Massachusetts, using this power, Winthrop proceeded to establish, with his allies, a whole array of Republican institutions, the like of which the world had never seen. With a system of government with actual elected officials who knew something, and which extended all the way from the township level to the legislature to the governor of the colony. They founded the first system of public education in the world, from grammar schools, local academies, and even Harvard College, which was then actually a publicly funded institution chartered by the legislature. And a written constitution, not one of these fake British things, you know, the unwritten constitution nobody knows about. It's called the Body of Liberties, which also overturned the use of any arbitrary precedent in English common law. And the legislature soon added an unprecedented protection for the citizens by ordering the printing of the laws. Sounds simple enough, but no one had done it. And Massachusetts devoted its only printing press to this task. And they did it, they said, whereby we may manifest our utter disaffection to arbitrary government. Their program for economic development, aimed always for the benefit of the entire population, was accelerated both by public subsidies, tax incentives. So as man, who is the most precious of all creatures, is here more vile and base than the earth we tread upon, and of less price among us than a horse or a sheep. Winthrop's argument was set forth as to the necessity of undertaking the colonization of the Massachusetts Bay, despite all practical notions about what was possible. And it essentially was a declaration of war against the oligarchy's insistence that man is no different from the beasts. So Winthrop started with the fundamental, shall we say, Republican economic policy declaration in human history. From Genesis, the whole earth is the Lord's garden, and he hath given it to the sons of men with a general condition, increase and multiply. Replenish the earth and subdue it, that man might enjoy the fruits of the earth and God might have his due glory from the creature. Why, Winthrop asked, suffer a whole continent as fruitful and convenient for the use of man to lie waste without any improvement? This is not an American exceptionalism to have the right to anti-nativist imperialism or manifest destiny, territorial greed. It was defined very clearly, John Winthrop, as governor of the Mass Bay Colony, defined, for example, Christian liberty as the liberty to do that only which is good, just, and honest. This liberty you are to stand for, he said, with the hazard not just of your lives, not just of your goods, but of your lives, if need be. And the battle to break the grip of the European oligarchy frequently required just that. Yet the Massachusetts Bay attained spectacular rates of growth. They rapidly developed such things as textile manufacturing, mining ventures, iron production. By 1647, in fact, John Winthrop's son, John Winthrop Jr., had overseen the construction of the world's first integrated, automated industrial complex at Saugus, Massachusetts, which by the end of its first year in 1647 was turning out 8 tons of automatically wrought iron per week, which was far beyond the best works in England or really anywhere else at that point. So all of this naturally drove the oligarchy, the Stuart monarchy, into fits of rage. And numerous assaults on New England as a whole, especially after John Winthrop Jr. as governor of Connecticut from 1657 until his death in 1676, replicated much of what his father's leadership had generated in Massachusetts. This tale of resistance is heroic enough in itself, escalating attacks on trying to revoke the charter, seize half of Connecticut by force of arms, so they can't hear. Little, bits of gunboat diplomacy, and by the mid-1670s, when all those had failed, the standard which the British would resort to all the way through into the late 19th century in our western plains, provoke some Indian raids, slaughter outposts of settlements. And in this case, the outbreak, the worst in New England history as an Indian war, so-called King Philip's War of 1675-76, laid waste to scores of towns in western Massachusetts and other outlying New England settlements. And well, I'm glad Dennis took care of all the jokes. Let me see. What do I do, Charles? No touch? I'm not sure people can hear from this height.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. One little quickie. Well, the effort to build a republic in America, launched by the leading Republican circles of Europe when it became clear that it simply couldn't be done there, was always conceived as a mission to benefit all of mankind. And from the beginning, the long struggle to found the United States was based on the idea that every human being was created in the image of God, endowed with the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and blessed with the ability to do God's work on earth. Lyndon LaRouche re-emphasized a few months ago the historically exceptional quality of the American Revolution and its federal constitution and historical specificity, which still today is unique in all of human history to date. And it began with the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, which was essentially the beachhead for beginning a project for a constitutional republic in the New World, and which provided Benjamin Franklin the traditions upon which he developed an entire independent, sovereign republic. John Winthrop, the founder, wrote in 1629 about the depths of degeneracy, familiar today also, then destroying England under oligarchical rule. He said, "This land grows weary of her inhabitants."